Okay.
All right. Well, glad it's cooled off in the classroom, Zach. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And I want to welcome you all to our second PI workshop of the semester. Thank you all for coming today. I'm Karen Appleby. I actually probably don't need to introduce myself because I think I know everybody here. So it's good to see everybody. People who I've seen a few times this semester and folks who I haven't seen for a while. So just a couple of things before we get started. I want to make sure we're trying to announce at all of the PI events that, you know, as we are in this unique learning environment right now, that the Instructional Technology Resource Center, also known as the ITRC, is available for any trainings, individual consults with you. If you're new to teaching on Zoom, if you're new to teaching about HyFlex, and I think it's just really important, especially for faculty who are new to campus. So Michelle, I don't know if you've been there or not, but if you haven't been to the ITRC yet, put it on your to-do list. And I even find that even though I've been on campus for a long time, I go to the ITRC quite often because I'm still trying to figure out all of this stuff too. So just want to make sure I put in a plug as we're navigating midterms and then finals for the ITRC. Today, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Zach Gershberg. Zach is going to be our workshop organizer and presenter today. Zach is an associate professor in the Department of Communication, Media, and Persuasion. He received his PhD from LSU, and he's taught at both the University of Montana and Cal State Stanislaus. Zach also has a very unique background in sport reporting, communication, sport and media. He was a reporter in Hawaii, covered sports, travel, and different features like that. He's worked in script development at Warner Brothers, so it's always cool to hear Zach's stories about that. And he also has a forthcoming book entitled The Paradox of Democracy, New Media and Bad Politics. So that's how interesting and timely all of that is, Zach. I'm excited to read your book. And Zach is going to be talking to us today about designing the matrix, ways to transform signature assignments into active learning opportunities. So I'll turn the time over to Zach.
All right, thank you, Karen. That's a very generous little bio there. But I want to thank everyone who's here today. It looks like Michelle, Nancy, Jim, Karen. Really thank you for joining us, and for those of you who are watching later online, thanks for clicking, I should say. And so this presentation, this sort of workshop, sort of came out of, I was able to present at a roundtable at a BYU conference on pedagogy earlier this year. Karen was there, and it was kind of interesting because it was literally the week before COVID. It probably wasn't the best thing in the world that Karen and Margaret Johnson and I were attending a conference right before the world shut down. But it was so interesting because I prepared some of it just for a roundtable, and then I knew this was scheduled for April, but obviously quite a bit has changed about pedagogy, technology, here at ISU and pretty much everywhere. So it was interesting figuring out what I wanted to change and what I wanted to stay the same. So really, I want to look into this as designing the matrix. So I have this screenshot sort of from the movie The Matrix from 1999. And that movie, some people love it, some people hate it, but it really questions what is our social environment. And it asks, is this a simulation? Now, I don't want to get into a real big, heady sort of metaphysical debate here. That's not my intention. We can save teaching postmodernism for another for another workshop maybe. But I think it's really important that we think about social environments and what is constructed, what is simulated, not just because of a movie from 20 years ago, but specifically because we've been exposed. The classroom itself has been exposed, the form of it, the construction of it, how we act as instructors, how students act as students because of these OWL cameras and Zoom. So it's really, now I think we should always have been paying attention to the classroom space and what we're doing with it and our roles, but now we have this kind of opportunity where we're now aware of it a little bit more than maybe we had taken it for granted. And so this is just kind of a little bit of an opening, but I'm Zach. Karen gave me the nice intro. And I'd say the one thing that I do here at ISU is I cover a lot of ground. My department chair is on the Zoom, so he can see you, but I teach intro-level journalism courses, advanced level journalism courses, and those can extend from newspapers to magazines to blogging to podcasting to radio. But I also teach screenwriting as well as media history and law. So I think that's something that I do pretty well, my breadth of my teaching. And so I'm always trying to find different assignments. And that's, I think, what I do well. And what I actually want to hear from, and feel free to take a minute, but I want to hear from everyone on the call, what is something, whether it is your ability to teach or design a course, I want you to maybe just reflect and share with us kind of something you do well as an instructor or as someone interested in pedagogy or something that you're interested in. And you don't have to share, like one thing I feel I do course design and cover a lot pretty well, but I'm maybe not so great as a lecturer. So I just want to hear from you guys, like what is something that you think you do well?
This would be easier if we could cover what I don't do well.
And it could also just be, I know this is sometimes a little bit of an awkward self-assessment, but it could be something you just enjoy doing as an instructor, whether it's putting together a lecture, delivering a lecture, putting together tests, what have you. Nancy, I think I saw your hand was raised. Go ahead.
So I think something I've learned over the years that I'm gaining confidence and think I can do well, and students tell me I do better than some other faculty in my program, is I create an environment and build trust early where students are willing to go out on a limb and be wrong and not see that as a negative thing. So I think building trust is one thing I've been able to do relatively quickly. And so that seems to engage learners much better when they can trust that what they have to contribute is well received, even if it's not fully accurate.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. That's good. Who else would like to share? Michelle.
I work in the nursing department, and so I have been a clinical nurse practitioner for 20 years. So what I like to think I bring to my students is real world experience and real world examples, so I can take what they're learning from the textbook and put it into real scenarios and examples. And I think they find me to be very real that way.
Okay. This is really good. This is really all you need to know about that movie, The Matrix. Like, can you trust that the real world exists? And so this is actually really good. Who else would like to share?
This is my 32nd year at ISU, and for a long time, I was captain of the SS Sink or Swim. Throw them overboard, and if they survive, great. If they don't, well, tough luck. In the last 10 or 15 years, with all of the new research on retention, I think I do a much, much better job than I used to at getting connected with students, staying connected with students, reaching out when they appear to be disappearing, and those sorts of things. So I think it's been over 10 years, maybe a bit more, just a major attitude change, in the approach, which I've welcomed and really enjoyed.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a great sort of narrative of growth, and certainly retention helps. I think we all agree on that.
Zach, I'll share. One of the things I like creating lectures. I like thinking about how to present. It might not be lectures. I just like thinking about how to present information in class. But one of the things sort of related to what Jim and Nancy just talked about is I teach students, like we all do, who are in various majors. And so I'll have exercise science, outdoor education, sport management, PE teaching, all in one class. So what I really like to do is think of creative ways to bring the content back to students in their majors. And it kind of surprises them every once in a while that, oh, she paid attention when I said I'm a PE teacher and not a sport management. So I like to always think about different ways to make content relevant to my students.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's great. Okay. Is Rachel with us? I don't know.
I am. I don't have my camera on. I'm multitasking. I'm a graduate teaching assistant. This is my first year teaching in this setting. So I'm here to learn from you guys. That's why I wanted to pop in. But my classes this semester and next semester are entirely online. So I'm curious about how to make it more engaging for them, even though it's all online.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great, and I think the diversity, I mean, and I think if you asked around the university, you would find educators all bringing, and I think with all different ideas that excite them or where they feel that they excel, and I think it's important that we actually talk about that. I think that could be really useful, and then leaning into our strengths a little bit. You know, in terms of the, you know, whether it's curriculum or issues of retention or, you know, issues of reaching program goals and everything like that. I'm going to have to maybe get some advice from Karen on lectures and presenting information. Because I think identifying too, like where we may struggle, you know, whether it's time management or other things. So I think that helps. But I want to thank you all for sharing with that. So I want to just go over some of these kind of workshop objectives here. And there's like a few different parts within the matrix. And I'm going to try to thread a needle here to have it all come together. So we'll see. But my goals are to introduce signature assignments. Some of you may have heard of this. Some of you may be very familiar with it. Others, you know, maybe we could look at different ways to use signature assignments. But I also want to show how signature assignments can maximize SLOs, or student learning outcomes, across the curriculum through transforming classroom spaces into active learning environments and fostering creative thinking skills. Can you see that, or is it blurred by this? This thing. Can you guys see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can see it.
Okay. So that's not a problem. Okay. So this is like a few different moving parts here, but the one thing I like about signature assignments, the one thing I like about active learning environments, the one thing I like about creative thinking skills and SLOs is these four concepts in pink are things really all across the university. And this is really difficult right at ISU. We have everything from nursing to pharmacy to media studies and to sports sciences to, you know, we're kind of a broad university, and yet we still all together have to meet accreditation. We have to, you know, define ourselves in a particular way. And so kind of what Karen was talking about, how do we meet students across the university and everything like that, but then also within our specific programs. That's really important as well. So the workshop objectives were for me, right? So this is something that I talked about in the spring at my other workshop, is that whenever someone has course objectives on their syllabus, that's great. That's for you as an instructor, but workshop outcomes are for the attendees, or in terms of syllabi, our students. So here's kind of my hope for the outcomes of this, is that attendees should be able to initiate department or college level discussions for adopting signature assignments that satisfy student learning outcomes, design signature assignments featuring transformed classroom spaces that create active learning environments, and a focus on assessing creative thinking skills. So even though those are very, very similar, I just wanted to flip it a little bit to share what I hope that all of you will be able to take away from it and actually, you know, perform these tasks. And, you know, if I go 1 for 3 or 1 for 4, that's a pretty good day at, you know, but we'll see. So those are my outcomes. And just, and so I'm going to go through them one by one, but my hope is that you can see that it builds on one another. In that in some ways, even though these are 3 concepts that sort of can stand alone, I think they do sort of come together in a really nice way. So to give you a little bit of a background, kind of where I come from, you know, pedagogically, I've been very interested for a number of years now, this notion of backwards design, and it comes from you know, a book and a whole series of literature from Wiggins and McTeague called Understanding by Design. This notion of backwards design, that when you're creating a course, you can focus on design backwards. So you start with the outcomes, then you think about reading materials, and those and assignments and those sorts of things, and only later do you focus on the actual content of it. So you start off with, what do I want students to be able to do, right? And then how do I create assignments, or how do I create assessments to gauge that they can do it? And then I think about materials and lectures and everything like that. So it's just a little bit of a twist, but I have to say it's really helped me and opened up my mind a little bit. And the whole idea that they have is that knowledge is created through this process of transfer, not passively between an instructor and a student, but that the student gains knowledge when they transfer it to actually doing something. So anyways, that's, I think, for me, has had a little bit of a kind of a profound effect, kind of in my kind of just overall perspective. It doesn't really change or influence me so much on a day-to-day, but it really has, I think, helped influence kind of how I approach a course, my relationship with students, and kind of how I discuss this curriculum with students as well. So the other thing I want to bring up, and this is just sort of a little bit of media research that I think it can be really valuable and useful to us right now, is that, so there's this idea of communication geography, and we have one geographer on campus, Yolanda Youngs, who knows this stuff a little bit better than me, but there's this great article that talks about the differences between place and space. And one of the issues, I think, is that we should be thinking about this no matter what, but now we've been forced to think about the differences between places and spaces, right? If we're just focused on place, I'm speaking in a room to no one, right? But we have digital space through Zoom, right? We have a totally different kind of digital space when it comes to Moodle, right? And so this relationship between place and space has really started changing with the evolution of media, learning management software, and kind of how we communicate with one another. And there's this 4 sort of key concepts that they go over that can help us maybe understand a little bit of, and you know, this piece was written or published 8 years ago, is that there's this notion of mediatized mobility, right? When it comes to communications, it's immersive, instantaneous, and portable, right? So we use it on the move. I don't know how many people have had students on Zoom, you know, from their workplace or somewhere, and it's like kind of jarring to sort of experience, but that's become a sort of condition within society, and sometimes mobility lacks richness. It brings us connection, but it can deprive us of richness. The other thing is technological.
I have students who have Zoomed in while they're driving.
Oh, God.
And I'm like, don't look at the screen, whatever you do.
That is by far the best example of mediatized mobility, and best in all the worst ways. It's like just we got over the hump where people kind of started respecting, you know, not using their cell phone while they're driving, and now they're logging into class. So that could be frustrating. But part of that goes to this other notion of technological conversion, right? This erosion of boundaries and hybridized communications. You know, so you can think of, yeah, using Zoom through a phone on a car to connect to class, right? And so we have this convergence of spaces within communication. And obviously, one thing about sort of the last 2 decades or so of media technologies, we've had high levels of interactivity. However, a lot of that interactivity is this sort of disembodied engagement through digital space. So it allows for more interactivity, whether it's, you know, higher education or video games. But these are also disembodied spaces. And then this concept of interfaces, that all of these technological tools, what they're doing is they're generating new patterns of communication. And so these 4 concepts, and, you know, kind of what I was talking about earlier with backwards design is just sort of this background kind of context of sort of where I'm sort of what I'm interested in, where I'm coming from, as I sort of look into the more specific aspects of signature assignments, active learning, and creative thinking skills. Okay, so now we can sort of begin here in earnest. Where signature assignments, it's kind of one of the, you know, big 3 things I wanted to talk about today. And so I'm curious how many people have heard of signature assignments before? Okay, so a few of you. So it's kind of weird. Signature assignments, when I first came across the concept, I just assumed for a few years that it meant this like, oh, like, this is my best stuff that I assign to my students. And that is like not, and I saw this word like pop up at like a few conferences and stuff like that. And this is before I was really engaged in a whole lot of pedagogical work. And it was like, oh, that's not what this is at all. Is that signature assignments are based on sort of, you know, 2 key principles. One, they're geared specifically for a kind of real world application of knowledge or skills, an experiential sort of assessment. So a little bit, you know, I think Michelle, you were talking about that, you know, real world skills, which obviously in your subject area, I think would be, you know, pretty important. But so signature assignments are explicitly based on this notion of real world application, right? But it sometimes can be discussed pretty vague. But the other really big thing here that you see with signature assignments, and this is the thing that sort of tricked me from the strict sort of denotation of the concept is that it is supposed to be a way to assess goals or curriculum kind of across the university, in that it scales up. So I have here horizontal or vertical. And so you see signature assignments. It can be a course meeting, program goals for a major. But it also could be like an honors class that is supposed to meet the goals of say, an honors college. Some schools have a university of president that puts together, some concepts, and every, intro level course is supposed to meet that. And sometimes it could be just very basic as of meeting the SLOs of a particular major or minor or gen ed goals. So really signature assignments are supposed to be this, they're sometimes referred to as key assignments. But the point is, it's not just a basic test or a basic essay or a presentation, but it's supposed to be some sort of application in the real world, or a simulation of the real world, hence my sort of intro on the matrix here. But then it has this other institutional function, or an assessment function that enables either scaling up through the university or across different divisions. And so at any rate, that was the jarring thing to me when I actually started looking into signature assignments. It's like, whoa, that just doesn't mean something cool that every professor has in their back pocket. It means something very, very specific, that it's a way. Now, as we've seen this, a lot of times they'll be accompanied by rubrics, and it could be a specific gen ed course or an institutional priority, but it doesn't always have to be that way. And so for those of you who have heard of signature assignments coming into this, I'm curious if those two aspects sort of meet up with your understandings, or if you wanted to add anything, or for those of you who weren't familiar with it, if you want to ask anything, so I want to start off small and then sort of move up from there. Yep, Nancy.
So I heard the term, I'm from physical therapy, and we had an instructional designer who was actually on our faculty for a while, and was very into helping us try to define what our signature assignments could be in specific courses across the 3-year Doctor of Physical Therapy program. We never completed actually connecting them, though, while we had our instructional designer. So we're partway there, but haven't made it to the end yet.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It's kind of interesting, and I think signature assignments comes out of the sort of instructional design sort of world. So it's very much tied to some of these processes. I know there has been, at least in my last go, there was some resistance among faculty because it was coming from these sort of instructional consultants and at the university. I mean, that's a whole drama I won't go into, but there was a little bit of where it was recommended and suggested, and we saw presentations, and then the faculty sort of balked at it a little bit. I mean, I'm not suggesting that's what happened in your course. I just want to point out that there is sometimes a little bit of friction that we sometimes see from the pedagogy world to every department as they consider adopting these.
So I think part of our specific point is we're also doing something called curriculum mapping, because it turns out we also do not know what everyone else is doing. So we're trying to do what we need to do to build on what they've had and where they're going, but we don't always communicate, or we can't even keep up with what everybody's doing. So then to select and design those signature assignments is going to be one mechanism I think will help. But first, we all have to get up to speed on who's doing what and when.
Right. Well,
That's something we did as a faculty earlier in the graduate schools. We did that. We took a whole day as faculty to map what we were doing so that there would be no repetitiveness, and it actually got us around to, not that this is related to this, but we're able to be more succinct in the books that we request so we know where they're being used. So.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, in some ways, they sort of go together. I mean, I would think in terms of mapping. In some ways, the signature assignments are kind of interesting because it's like, okay, we're going to do this in a particular course to gauge these sort of program outcomes that we need to satisfy. And so yeah, okay, that's good. Did anyone else have any, comments or thoughts about signature assignments, first hearing about them, or kind of the two-step I have here about this?
I just thought it always meant cool assignments, or maybe cool and big assignments.
Big assignments, the biggest, most beautiful assignments. Okay, so I want to share this particular quote, and I don't know if I hyperlinked this one. Some of the other research, I mean, I have this as a PDF, but I think in some of the others I actually have links to it. But here's kind of I think kind of a nice quote. Signature assignments require students to demonstrate their proficiency in one or more key learning outcomes. This typically involves synthesizing, analyzing, and applying cumulative knowledge and skills through problem or inquiry-based assignments or projects. So among some of the scholarship on signature assignments, sometimes it comes from instructional designers, but I have to say, sometimes I like reading through these things to try to find something that is really just seems sort of new, or a twist, where it's not just, okay, the bureaucracy in academia is telling every department, you must have signature assignments, right? And I was very struck by this, problem or inquiry-based assignments or projects. And so I think one of the really nice things about signature assignments is that they sort of lend themselves to posing a problem and solving a problem. And sometimes that problem is a meta thing about how are we gonna, meet accreditation goals. But at the same time, also within the assignments themselves in the classes for the students, I thought this kind of just helped me sort of understand signature assignments in kind of a new way. And so, even though I just made a little crack on bureaucratic academic sort of jargon, I'm going to use the most odious form of bureaucratic academic financial sort of jargon with the ROI, right? Return on investment. And so this is just like a helpful sort of kind of slogan I want to put out there. ROI SLO. So like why or how can signature assignments help us? And I think it allows us to maximize our return on investment for assessing student learning outcomes. Every class needs to have, right, student learning outcomes, right? I mean, that comes from our accrediting body. And that's like, a big thing, right? So the question is, we're all facing issues of content and scheduling, right? This semester and next semester more than ever, they just lopped off a week, right? From us this semester. So we all start thinking of, well, how am I gonna compress all this stuff? How am I gonna get through all this stuff, right? But the one thing I think where signature assignments can actually really help us as faculty, I'm not talking at the institutional level, is you could get more bang for your buck. There's a return on investment here where you can actually help yourself a little bit, but at the same time, there is a sort of bureaucratic value in some ways here for assessment and accreditation, right? And sometimes this can be like gnashing teeth. Why do we have to do this? How can we do this, right? But the one thing about signature assignments is they provide they provide an opportunity for assessment, really clear assessment, I think, at the course level, at the program level or major level, as well as an institutional level. In the sense because you can show the actual skills of knowledge through outcomes. So, I worked with Karen all last year, right? We dealt with assessment stuff, or the pedagogy of assessment. And I know there's another committee dealing with assessment. We're all, trying to figure out assessment, and it sometimes can be a little bit of a pain, but part of it is to help us become better educators, but also to make sure that our students are actually doing the things that we're offering. and so I think signature assignments, as I'll go into, provides this an opportunity for assessment leading into accreditation that can be helpful. But it's easy for me to tell you all that. It's much harder for me to show, well, here's how a faculty member in nursing or in philosophy or in business or in pharmacy can actually do this. But the one thing in terms of ROI, SLO that I see with signature assignments is that it can really provide a benefit, especially in a compressed semester that's high flex, right? Or one that gravitates online midway through, is because what you're doing is you're broadening out the assessment into one project that could be can use scaffolding, right? And so even though they call them signature assignments, one thing I'll go into is I actually think it would almost be more appropriate if they called these signature projects. But I am curious, is anyone here familiar with this term of scaffolding? No. So scaffolding, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. This is Amy Hardy. I'm in communication sciences and disorders and scaffolding. Usually in therapy, we scaffold, the child's learning, or not usually an adult because they know, but if they're coming in as a new to the material, then it's sort of a stepladder approach to their learning. And usually that Bloom's taxonomy, I think, does some scaffolding types of things.
Okay.
Yeah, but I may be off.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of this ladder approach where you're having benchmarks along the way, and there's opportunity as faculty to provide feedback to students as they move up. And that's why I think in some ways, rather than a signature assignment, you can almost see it as a project for ways I'll get into. But so scaffolding could be brainstorming, and then a proposal, then a draft, then another draft, and then a presentation, and then an essay, right? So it's a project with a number of different sort of assessment points that really contribute to the learning process for students to have that chance to sort of improve their work along the way. And so anyways, I think in terms of course design, signature assignments provide benefits to kind of just like if you're a faculty member you have to teach a course, you have to put together a syllabus and everything like that, thinking, you know, how am I going to get this all in a semester? Having a large project with scaffolding can kind of give you some of these access points, not only to improve student learning, but help solve some of those riddles that you got to negotiate when it comes to class time, high flex, the semester schedule and everything like that. So these are kind of what, even though I think it's great that, you know, this is, I mean, there are the advantages for assessment and accreditation. My real focus here, what I really care about is that for all of us teaching and faculty across that we can be helped in this period where the teaching environment is this sort of digital crazy matrix that we're all really trying to figure out. Okay, so with signature assignments, and this gets a little bit at the scaffolding, though the slide really doesn't help that it's going to go in a linear fashion, not a horizontally, not vertically. But one of the things that I really like about this idea is that if you scaffold a signature assignment, one of the things you actually can do with this is that if it's a project that takes place over a course of a few weeks or a month or even more, is that you can have a period where students have to demonstrate knowledge with some preliminary work, whether it's brainstorming, research, what have you, and then you can have an instrument such as a paper or a presentation or field work. I'll go into some examples in a minute here. So you sort of build up to this kind of moment, right, where something is due or a presentation is delivered or they actually show it through application. And then there's a way afterwards to have this kind of reflection about it. And what we're talking about with that is that in terms of assessment, you can gauge students in terms of their ability to comprehend knowledge and content, right? There's an opportunity for you to assess how they apply that in some ways. And then ideally at the reflection level, right, this notion of metacognition, right, that they can reflect on it in some ways. So I think this is actually kind of nice, and it's not just like one big thing that's worth 30% of their grade, is that it's broken up a little bit. And students are able to learn, they're able to demonstrate that learning or demonstrate that knowledge. Then they could demonstrate it through skills and then reflect on that, the work that they did, or importantly, as I'll get to, the work that others do. So how am I doing so far? I mean, are there any objections? Not being place-based, this is digital state, you can't throw rotten fruit or vegetables at me or boo and hiss me so in person, so it doesn't take this. But no, in all honesty, I am curious, like, is there anything I could pause and go over, or we good?
I think it is a nice reminder to think about the steps, because you're right. Generally, we just do the applied skills, right? We just say, here's the big paper, write it, turn it in. And that preliminary work, we just expect, especially, even at the graduate level, we just assume coming in that they know how to brainstorm, that they know how to research. And many times they're missing that and don't spend the time, so then that definitely messes up that next step. And so also that reflection piece is challenging. I think most of the time they get the grade and we move past it instead of reflecting back and having it really make an impact moving forward. Then they just tend to make the same mistakes moving forward. So I think this is a helpful visual to just go, things do need to be in steps, but especially we just get so busy in the end result that we forget that first and that third step.
That's a really great point. Amy, thank you for that. Like, one of the things that has always struck me as a little bit odd is that we always have, final exam week is the end of the semester. And again, in the movie industry, you never end with the biggest climax. Like, movies don't end that way. You need a resolution. You need 5 to 10 minutes to cool down, reflect, show the new world after the big battle scene, or when the jilted lover objects at the wedding, right? Like, you need to bring it down, and like that and part of that is that it's this notion of reflection, and so we sometimes build up to this big, final paper or final exam or something, and then that's it. The semester's over. Everyone's going away. It's okay. I'm going skiing in Jackson. Bye. That's sometimes how it works. But that period of reflection can be really valuable.
Zach, can I add something to that? Because I think Amy's point's really important too. I said earlier, I teach the senior capstone class, and one of the first questions I ask, because I want them to reflect on their curriculum as a whole, what have you learned in this program? One of the first questions I ask is, okay, so what classes did you take? And it's like this silence. And it scares me because we don't take that reflection time. I mean, then when I jog their memories, you took these classes and what assignments did you do in those classes? Silence, and so students are just always, it's so much information, and it's, they're getting it so quickly. And that reflection piece is something that I want to do better at in my own classes. But yeah, I think it's hard for them to remember all of the things that they've learned, and, classes and those types of things. So.
Sure. Thank you. And Nancy, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, so I was just going to confirm that essentially I agree with Amy that we focus on that applied skills part, but essentially you're taking the grade for that as well and distributing across multiple areas and giving feedback. So if their preliminary work is not at the level it should be, they have an opportunity to up it before that applied skill is done. And then on the reflection end, they get additional credit in some ways for reflecting on it instead of putting all of that effort just into the applied skill. And the other thing I thought this might do is reduce the whole procrastination effect of the person who does it all in one lump thing, even though it's supposed to be something that requires greater effort. Some of my students particularly incredibly skilled at just getting it done for whatever they think you want, rather than generating something that is what the intent of the assignment is for. So I think distributing the points along with the opportunities for feedback in between is beneficial.
That's a really savvy point. It's not really necessarily what I was going to go into today, but one of the things I've started doing is, like, if I have a draft due, I'll make that really valuable. And so the big paper or the big test, I've started reducing the point value of some of those things, and like making due dates for these sort of process level things or reflection level things that I would otherwise just ignore or just be kind of optional or something. So yeah, I mean, and that's what I mean, or what I was sort of alluding to with this maximizing your SLOs, maximizing your schedule, but then you do have to find time to make those things due. And if something's due every day over the course of the semester, that's not going to work either, right? Okay. So here's just some examples of signature assignments that you kind of see, and it's funny if you look in some of the pedagogy scholarship on this, you'll see it in you'll see some published articles in like health science, you'll see it in engineering, you'll see it all across you know, higher academic curriculum. So it is kind of nice, but really you have capstone projects, professional pitches or presentations, service learning projects, field work, white papers, digital portfolios or blogs, grant writing. I know here at ISU, Alex Bollinger has the, where he has students like actually literally publish a book. It's like this remarkable, so that would be, I mean, that's a really highly, I think, advanced level of a sort of signature assignment in some ways, where the whole course is devoted to this one thing. But there's many different ways that this could be accomplished. But it does stress, right, the two basic things is that it's going to have some experiential sort of real world application, and then it's going to satisfy some, you know, whether it's some goals, whether it's the goals of a program or major, or you know, at a college level, an institutional level, a gen ed level. So a lot of times we see, and that sometimes sucks up all of the focus of signature assignments, is about satisfying that that level. But I'm just really interested in some ways, kind of what you know Nancy was getting at there, was how it allows for this, you know, you can, you know, adjust your grading in some ways to allow for kind of some progress here. So those are the examples. I guess my point is, or what I would like to transition in, because here's kind of the move I have, is that signature assignments is like, how could we think about this for faculty who, you know, we can't be in control, all of us, at the institutional level of assessment or accreditation sometimes. But like, what as just a faculty member where is the real value here in terms of that ROI? And number one, is you can really help create an active learning environment. And number two, as I'll get to a little bit later, is that you can really facilitate creative thinking skills. And a lot of times, that's what we do even when we don't think we're actually doing it. But in terms of active learning, it privileges student engagement, right? It avoids passive listening roles. One example you hear a lot of is in lectures. Instead of just lecturing the class, you break them up into think, pair, share sort of groups, and so it's that learning is best achieved through this sense of engagement. And really what active learning is doing is it's transforming the social space of the classroom. So that could be using in a bigger class that's high flex, right? Using the breakout facilities in Zoom, using that. Or, I mean, we'll see. I don't know how long it will take till we have students back in the classroom and can actually break them up into groups. It seems like such a banal thing, but it's like, will it be a year, 2 years? I don't know. I mean, it's just, I mean, that's what I was getting at earlier, where it's just, I feel as though the pandemic has really forced me to think about space, classroom space and place in really different ways. So the one thing about active learning is a lot of the work you sometimes hear about active learning just when it comes to lectures, that there's ways to really energize the lecture or change the lecture by having a sort of active learning environment, which, right, makes sense. And so that's where a lot of times I would see this concept of active learning. And so I'm curious, before I continue, I just wanted to see, is this mesh with those of you who come across this concept of active learning before? Is there anything anyone would want to add? Okay, so I can go.
I wanted to mention one thing we do. I think we do it a little bit better in CMP 2201, which is business and professional communication. And I kind of want to go back to the demonstrate, apply, reflection. Is in 2201, for every outline that they turn in for their presentation, they also have to turn in, we kind of call it a cover page. And there they have to justify their choice of a structure and their 3 top persuasive appeals. And I tell them, this isn't just busy work. You can think of it that way, I suppose, but that's not the right way to think about it, or at least it's not the best way. And what I'm trying to get from them, and I tell them this, is that you're thinking strategically about your choices when you're putting together a presentation, so that your moves were conscious. And you're telling me that they were conscious and explaining to me why they were better than some other moves you might have made. And I think that kind of reflection, really helps them to remind them that every speaking situation is a strategic one, or at least should be.
Okay. Yeah, no, and that's kind of in terms of, because I think Amy mentioned something earlier about number 1 and number 3 sometimes get forgotten. But yeah, that's definitely where I'm heading with this, because part of it is that, especially in those fields that are heavily skill-based, right? They have to be able to do it, but in terms of creating room for different learners, right? Part of scaffolding, what it might do is help people think about the skill before they actually demonstrate it, right? And the question is, how do we have outlets for those thinking strategically about the skill in question? So yeah, cover pages are excellent examples. And so part of the thing that really leapt out to me was, this is an article from back in 2016. It's actually about signature assignments. And even though the article isn't about putting signature assignments with active learning environments, like the point of the workshop, this is kind of like a little bit of the inspiration for how I put this together. Was this quote: "Designing active learning engagements means faculty need to be less concerned with content, more concerned with stimulating students through situational experiences that challenge students to grapple with real-world problems." And in some ways, like, this struck me, it was just kind of like a throwaway sentence at the end of this paragraph. It wasn't a throwaway, I don't want to say that. But it was so interesting. I was like, wait, active learning, I thought we were talking about signature assignments. But I thought it was just a way to put these two things together in a really remarkable sort of way. And so what I think a helpful way to think about signature assignments, or even any sort of assignment, is how can we enrich the learning environment, not just in our lectures, but specifically within what we're assessing itself. And so this is, again, a little bit of a wind-up here, but the ecology of learning that we have, right? We're all facing problems of time and space. How am I going to get through this hour and 15-minute class period? How am I going to get this all in 17 weeks? No, 16 weeks with Thanksgiving. Oh, now Monday and Tuesday of week 15, but then totally online week 16, right? And then, before we even started today, I think, Jen, you said with HyFlex in Zoom, what takes 5 minutes in class could take 20 minutes in the HyFlex. And we're dealing with time, and we're always dealing with problems of space and place in the classroom, but we always sort of just took it for granted. Now we can't take it for granted, right? With half the class maybe in person, or a fifth of the class in person, and then everyone else on Zoom. I almost feel like I used to be a waiter through college. And I remember if you have like 5 tables you have to get to, you're always like that. And having students in class, and then it's like you're always trying to, your head's on a swivel. But I guess the point here is the classroom is always constructed. And now that's just very obvious. Or maybe it should be. And you don't have to get all, again, into postmodern theory and understanding the movie The Matrix to really recognize that or accept that now. And that as faculty, we tend to perform instruction as, lecturers, adjuncts, professors, what have you. And students inhabit the role of a student. But that's changed now, right? You could be teaching from your office chair, right? Students, as the appalling example that was mentioned earlier, that a student zoomed in while driving in their car. Oh my goodness, that just brings to mind so many legal questions that we're just gonna put to the side and for now. And so these are the challenges we kind of face, but with active learning environments, I think where they really come together here and what can help solve these problems of time and space we have is a sort of immersive simulation signature project. Now that's a whole mouthful of marbles. But what I'm really trying to do here is seeing it to what extent we could enjoying these. And so there's sort of 3 big things that would be required. And this is sort of my big kind of throw here, is that we can designate assumed roles for students in their work. So they're not working as students. They're working as students working as an executive, or as a consultant, or as a practitioner in some way. But you can imagine for them, have them inhabit a particular role when they do their work. And we heard something earlier, right, about having a cover letter due with like a proposal or something like that. And all work, inform, convince, solve problems. So that's one thing. But then here's the really big thing, I think, in terms of playing with space and kind of the simulation of the classroom, is empowering a peer audience to function as decision makers who can ask relevant questions and exercise judgment in some ways. So what I'm suggesting here in these first 2 bullets is trying to invigorate from that one slide, 1, 2, and 3, the preliminary work, the instrument performance, and then the reflection. Is that it's no longer just students as students, but they're within a sort of, they're already part of a simulation that we call higher education. And I'm not trying to pretend that it's not the real world, but this is where real world experiences are facilitated. And so what I would suggest is, I know there's lots of courses in different departments that use sort of peer reviews and stuff. But think about it this way, a lot of those peer reviews are usually, as a student, I'm assessing another student, right? So what I'm suggesting is that we can sort of create a sort of universe for our classrooms and assume different roles And so at any rate, how can you pull this off? Part of it is setting, as an instructor, as a faculty member, with these sort of bigger assignments, you can set controls like budgets or baselines and allow other students to assess and evaluate not just themselves, but others, and that not need even be sort of aired out in public. Like, so just as a quick example, you know, what I do when I teach, you know, a course like media literacy, which is just a gen ed intro level course. I have students work in groups, and it's this big sort of scaffolding type of project where they each have a particular company, a different media company that they're pitching to, that they think that they should, they need to demonstrate that they understand the company, and based on their understanding of technology and audience, make a few recommendations. So they deliver this, but I actually have the students pretend that they are on the corporate board, and that they have to ask questions, and they have to choose a particular consultancy group. But I don't want my class to necessarily be a popularity contest like Survivor, and they vote certain groups off the island. But in some ways, I task them with, okay, you can choose 2 or 3 groups. Like, why would you do it in terms of the effectiveness of the ideas, the budgetary constraints of implementing them, right? And so now if you're doing peer reviews, they're not doing them as students about other students. They're imagining themselves in a particular role, right? And so at any rate, this is how kind of you can foster an active learning environment kind of within it. I think a signature assignment sort of does this almost anyway, but it's just a sort of creative way to be able to invigorate the classroom space and those who inhabit it. So are there any questions about that? I mean, there's something almost like dystopian science fiction about immersive simulation signature project. So I can understand some hesitancy there, but.
I have a question, Zach, just really quick. That's such a great idea, putting students sort of in the shoes of, you know, somebody with a different perspective. So do you do any role play training for the students of, so if you're a CEO of a company and you're on a hiring committee or something, here's what your role is, here's what you would look for. Is there any of that so students really get themselves into that mindset?
So it depends on the specific course, and it depends on if it's just like a simple reflection or if it's now there are some, there is a little bit of movement, and it's kind of like gameplay. It's like, I've seen like certain history professors, I mean, some might do it here, but I know of, I have some history colleagues at another institution where like, it's like 2 weeks of training about your role, and then you like act that role out. And so if it's just, I think it depends on the course I'm taking in particular and how much interaction there is. The more interaction there would be, the more training about the particular role there probably should be. But I mean, even at a sort of basic kind of level of an assignment, it's just it can be a small way to sort of jazz up the space, or it could be a really serious intervention or simulation from that perspective. Amy?
Yeah, so we had to do simulation because, you know, clinic and everything shut down. And so the simulation, it was sort of reminded me, and this was the first time that we had used simulation, and of course a company's making a lot of money because they've designed it, but it was interesting because it's sort of like those stories where you choose your own adventure. And so when I think of simulation, it's not just cut and dry, here's what happens. It's the way that the simulator would respond would be based on the student's response. So if they weren't paying attention to the mother, let's say, and she has a child with significant disabilities, and they ask something, you know, to the mother like, well, how do you think he got this disability, and do you think he'll outgrow it? Well, then the simulator, it would actually answer by either crying or, you know, doing these things. So it actually responded to the student, which would take forever, you know, to design. So I'm thankful that this company did that, but it really, they were in these simulation experiences that it was, you know, choose your own adventure. You're not going to meet the 90% accuracy rate if you're asking parents the wrong questions or collaborating with other professionals. And so there are some, you know, simulation type of experiences, but because we couldn't do that for the whole summer, we did do some role playing where they took on being the therapist and then someone having a stroke. And that was really challenging for our students to play the role of the person that had the stroke, whereas I thought them being the therapist was going to be, you know, because they're fresh out the gate. And I thought that would be, but it was more challenging for them to actually be the stroke, you know, client and have these challenges and then have to role play that. So we learned a lot from that kind of peer, you know, and then that decision making in the moment of what they were going to do and how they were going to respond if they can only speak in, you know, one words, and what that would look like. So some neat experiences for role play and simulation.
Right. Yeah, and there's limits in terms of like role playing, right, with questions of cultural appropriation and some of these sort of other elements for sure. But I mean, I'd be curious what like those students who had to role play on the other side as a stroke victim, if it at all gave them, I don't know, some insight that they could use as a therapist.
Yes, and so thankfully we did fill out a quick little Google form, you know, a Google quiz to say, you know, how did you feel about this experience? Do you think it will help you? And we have yet to analyze their responses and things, but because everything just happened so quickly. But thankfully we put that out there because at first glance, yes, most everyone said, wow, being in someone else's shoes. And I think for, you know, the generation of students, being able to take someone else's perspective has really been a challenge in our field. Professionally, looking how someone might feel or someone might respond, that's been really hard to teach. And this summer, that was invaluable to have them role play someone with a disability.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of remarkable also to see the some of the simulation games on, you know, because that's a good way to distinguish that, right? There are like online simulations, and then there's kind of role playing that we can do in the classroom. One thing I found it to be highly effective in training for news and media literacy is there's actually an online simulation. It's a fake news game where you actually have to create fake news headlines. And it's like the orange party and the purple party, so it's like nothing is real, but the more inflammatory you are, the better it is. And the students were so horrified that they're like, I'm going to be more careful when I look at headlines now. Because the whole point was, I was like, after you do it for a certain amount of time or get to have done, just show a screenshot of it. But then what I really care about is you to write a reflection on what that experience was like, the escalating aspect of it. But I don't know, that was kind of bizarre, but it was this crazy simulation I was able to find. But I guess I would say is you can also control whether you want to use a program or if you want to create those conditions within the course itself with respect to the assignment design. And like part of the big thing is, right, this bottom bullet, setting controls like budgets and baselines. So when I teach a course called political communication, and one of the things I have them do as this kind of final project is they have a fantasy draft and they choose a candidate for the next presidential election. So that'll be 2024. So if we do, I mean, hopefully they figure out who wins the election. But part of what they do is I create a control sheet of what GDP is, and I kind of try to, so no one can just like make up the unemployment rate or something like that, because the point isn't like what happens in the future, it's how do you take information and then apply it and sort of create the strategies of a campaign. And Jim, I saw you posted something to the chat. Do you want to share with us? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I teach empathy in my group communication class because research has shown it's really, it could be up to 40% of a group's success. And empathy is defined as the ability to read other people's nonverbals and react appropriately. And I've read of hospitals basically teaching empathy who hire actors to play the role of patients and getting diagnoses. But the important part of this, again, kind of goes back to the reflection. The MD or the PA giving the diagnosis to the actor and responding and reacting is then looked at later by the entire group of physicians, and then they're critiqued and evaluated and they talk about how they could do better. So again, it's not just the role playing that counts, it's the reflection afterward.
Yep, Nancy.
So, hearing this and hearing what everybody else is doing, I may have been doing something without realizing it that could have fit as an immersive simulation signature project that's active learning. So I'm a neuromanagement physical therapist. So people have had stroke, spinal cord injury, head injury. And after teaching the course for a while, I ended up taking away one lab period and splitting students into groups and into pairs and inviting in people who have a neurologic injury, because invariably they're not fully cured, even though they've received all the services, and not as a patient. And my students are not licensed therapists, but they're simulating if they were the therapist, if this was a patient, even though this is a volunteer can say no to absolutely anything, and worked for an hour and a half once a week with this person for 12 weeks of the semester. We'd spend the initial labs learning what they needed to be able to do. And then I had the students develop a portfolio across the semester that they turned in 3 times, in which they would investigate the diagnosis. So people would have different diagnoses, and they would pick what kind of tests and measures they would use. They would research what types of interventions they could use, and a lot of them we were covering in classes we would go. And invariably the volunteers would invite them to their homes to do a home assessment, or to their workplace or something. So they'd have this simulated what therapists would do with a patient, but they're doing it with a volunteer who actually has and manifests the problems that someone has. It's not acute care, it's not rehab, it's more like outpatient. All the people were not necessarily eligible for services, but it gave them this opportunity. And the downside, right, is they get to know this one diagnosis and this one person's experience. But I did have them also present to their classmates twice during the semester what their findings, what their thoughts were, and receive feedback, as well as grading their portfolios. So would that be considered a simulation, even though it's using real people with these diagnoses from the community, right? Simulating PT care.
I mean, I think so. I use the word simulation not as a way to confuse, but even when we're bringing real world skills application to the classroom, it's still a constructed space within a classroom, right? Like even if the skills aren't simulated, but that's like sort of how you learn. And so, and that's what I mean, that place space distinction has been totally blurred now. So I think that's great, like leaning into it like that. And is absolutely, I mean, that's a terrific example.
We teach a class called Groups and Communication, and it's actually mandatory for, I don't know if all, but quite a number of health professions folks. And what we try to do, actually, John Grievous created the entire course, so I get no credit for this. I shouldn't get any, none. I just stole it all from him, whole. But what we've kind of done over the last year is they're in the class, they do a project, and we try to, one of the things groups used to do is, solve the problem of attendance at the football game. This is a very unreal problem because the students don't know anything about how to do attendance at the football game. So we try to select something that they can do in class. It could be just as simple as, how are you going to stay in touch with each other for the last project of the class? How are you going to meet? And so we put them through all the paces on that. And then the last week of class, we give them 6 questions that will be on the exam. They will only have to answer 2 of them, but they have to apply, and each of them asks them to apply the concepts from class to their group. And they sit and discuss in a group how that concept works. So for an example, leadership emergence is discussed. Usually everybody starts out as a possible leader, and by the end of the first meeting, the people who are asses or who just didn't say anything drop out of contention. And so we have them talk about how leadership emergence worked in their group. And so that if that question is the one selected for the final, all of their answers may look a little bit similar, but they've all reflected on how that operated in their group, and they get some experience doing it. And they really seem to have, I thought it might be difficult for them discussing who emerged as a leader and how that worked out, but it really doesn't appear to work that way. They seem to have a really good time putting their experience together and applying the concepts to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. And the other thing is, like that one slide I had very early on about the changes to media over the last few decades, is we went from this sort of mass media model where people watched television, just sat there with the clicker, and it was a very passive experience, or they got the newspaper. And I mean, so it's kind of sad on the one hand professionally to see that world kind of go away, but the themes or the characteristics of kind of the world of convergent media or digital media is interactive, it's role playing, all of those elements of sort of, it's very participatory, whether it's video games or social networking. And so that idea of being able to assume a new persona, whether it's as a listener or as a student. So I mean, I think anytime you can sort of energize the space where it's not just students presenting to other students, writing a paper as a student, all of, I think that can really add that sense of sort of richness, because that's sort of how, kind of not just media, but kind of social interactions, take place. And I think it can help because it fosters this kind of active learning environment, which again, a lot of the scholarship, not all, but just a lot of active learning environments work goes to lectures and basic things. But I think with assignments themselves, It's a real opportunity. So let me just, I mean, obviously in certain fields, you're going to need to demonstrate specific skills, right? You're going to have to be able to assess their specific understandings, comprehension, knowledge, what have you. So one of the best ways, if you're thinking, and this doesn't even have to be a signature assignment, though I think it can, I think it makes sense, is this notion of the pitch, right? And so I call this the pitch matrix. We all pitch, just differently. For those of you who have a faculty job, you wrote a cover letter and your CV, right? Your cover letter is a pitch, right? Every movie you've ever seen made, every TV or streaming series you've ever seen was pitched before the script was ever made. But consultants, entrepreneurs, artists, scientists, we all pitch, right? Just a little bit differently. We need contracts, grants, advances, equity. You know, even though Mark Burnett, he was the producer that first came up with Survivor, and then with Donald Trump, The Apprentice, but he also created, I don't know if anyone's seen the show Shark Tank. All it is basically sort of venture capital startup pitches. That's it. And there's a rhythm to it. And so obviously this is a little, it's sometimes easier in screenwriting. Movies and television and streaming shows have to be pitched. But there's ways in written and presentation form that you can think about what's a better way to have this type of intervention, or to secure this type of funding, or to do something better at this particular institution. By that, I mean, it can be any institution. And so I think the sort of our contemporary world, how it works from its economy to even academia itself, like what's a grant, right? Other than you pitch. So you pitch for money, like, but you pitch for resources and you pitch for opportunities. And so I think one thing I'd like to suggest, and it could be a little bit easier in some worlds in some fields than others, is like, so how do we pitch, right? Like what do y'all pitch? I mean, I know, you know, Karen, you studied sports, and I'm just thinking how there's always like every summer doesn't like and then there's been a lot of corruption with like the Olympics and the World Cup, how it's awarded, right? But also like where the NCAA has Final Fours or these sorts of things, right? I mean, so there's a competitive aspect to pitching, and even though television ratings have gone down, that show Shark Tank, I find that my students have actually watched that, even though it's the damnedest thing in the world. Students don't watch TV anymore. It's so hard to have a common conversation anymore. That always used to be an easy go-to. But there's a certain level of pitching, and it can be for a job, but it can be for other types of things. So what are the contexts in which we pitch gatekeepers or people who are executives? What are the forms of pitching? And so it's not going to work for every single course or every single assignment, but I think it's a way to really invigorate the space. And I also, I mean, there's this interesting thing, Jeff Bezos at Amazon, right? Wealthiest guy in the world. He requests from people in Amazon at any level, but he demands a pitch for a new idea for them to pursue. It has to be a 6-page letter, and you have to work out, and it needs to be structured in a particular way in 6 pages, where you talk about your overall like theory of the digital e-commerce world, and then get to your specific thing. So it's like there's a way to have a form, and it doesn't always have to be in a business mindset either. It can be about a better way of doing something. And so, at any rate, so I kind of want to know what do you all pitch? Like, what are the ways in which ideas or funding opportunities or you know, how are things pitched? So I mentioned before on my media literacy course, how they pretend like they're consultants. And sometimes pitches fail. One of the big things I talk about in media literacy was how in 2007, MySpace was the most visited place on the internet. And News Corp, which was owned by Rupert Murdoch, spent $600 million to purchase MySpace. And that's just as Facebook was going, sort of opening up to everybody. And some consultant somewhere said, yeah, this is going to be a good idea. Well, 6 years later, News Corp sold off MySpace for like $20 million. So they took like a $580 million loss on that, which I'm sure they got tax credits for. And but at any rate, so I think it's important, like, how do these things, they can't even be a historical thing, right? And so in political communication, I mentioned this, they do a future presidential campaign. In media law, when I teach that, I have them write legal briefs and draft amicus curiae, which are just sort of petitions to the court by an outside group. So I have them actually, you see it kind of all the time when there's a big Supreme Court case or something. So I actually have them, and then I have other students pretend that they're the justices, and they have to rule. But they're limited to parsing which amicus curiae were more convincing and why. And so at any rate, I do that, and then in screenwriting, you know, they have to pitch the film before they even start the script. And when I co-taught with Shannon Cobbs-Nabotyak, who's in geology, we co-taught an honors course, Geology in the Movies, where we looked at really bad science movies. And I taught the Hollywood angle, and she taught the actual science to it. But at the end, we had them think about a potential natural disaster and how it could be made into a movie. And so they had to write a paper on the actual science of it, and then about how they would, when and how they would violate science in furtherance of the story. And like one of the things I did, it was ridiculous. I even tried to change up the space a little bit by having Fiji water there. Like they're all Hollywood executives listening to pitches, because that's like the fancy thing to do. And it was ridiculous. I mean, you could get, right, you know, so it was a waste of plastic, but they were just like really excited, right, to like ask questions, pretending they're a producer at Netflix or Disney or something like that. So it's like whatever you can do in some, and you don't have to buy Fiji water or anything like that, is really thinking about the spaces, transforming the spaces. So I'm just curious, for those of you, I mean, Jim, I know, I mean, how obvious some of the pitches are to what you do, but I mean, with everyone, like, I'm just curious, where do people pitch something, whether it's a new idea or a business opportunity or funding in your fields? Yep, Nancy.
So mine's kind of a really different take, and I'd never would have thought of it as a pitch because I don't use that terminology, but in the class I teach, it's students in their last academic semester as physical therapists, and the course is all about how to recognize what looks like something a physical therapist would treat, like ankle pain or shoulder pain, is actually due to an undiagnosed, unrecognized medical diagnosis like cancer or heart attack or something like that. And the students have to take the patient data and then recognize whether it's something within our scope we can treat or refer back. And referring back is really hard because no physician wants a person back that they just sent to you. And so you have to organize which key components of the data are the most compelling in the best order with a compelling rationale that's going to get their attention. And be able to make that, I'm going to call it now a pitch instead of just a rationale. But that would qualify, right? That they have to get the physician's agreement to take this person back for something that a PT thinks is going on when we have no diagnostic imaging to prove it. We're just using our tests and measures in the history to compile a compelling rationale of, hey, this is not in my scope of practice.
I think, yeah, no, that's a great example. I think the three big things to any pitch, you have to inform, convince, and solve some sort of problem. And I think, I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's a movie or, you know, the referral back. You know, I mean, I think that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example. Yeah.
I think also in the health professions, although they might have a hard trouble with the language of pitch, but really you have to pitch to the patient that you need to follow through on the diagnosis. And sometimes that's the huge breakdown. I mean, I've got a faculty member or two here who do health communication, and, you know, they kind of talk about that's the huge breakdown, is actually getting patients to follow through on the prescriptions. So.
Hey, last month, the administration, the Health and Human Services for the federal government solicited pitches for a $250 million contract to about public health messaging just for like the next 5-6 months. And so obviously this was coming from communications firms. Those communications firms, in order to pitch, would probably need to have a public health advisor, right? So yeah, I mean, and I think in terms of, you know, you don't all have to be, right, a communication professor to be able to do this. I think part of it is the ability to, again, inform, convince, solve problems. I mean, that's something that is just in all of our fields that we're facing.
Well, and I think the students enjoy the participation in honing, and they can even self-evaluate, but they can also see the reaction of everyone around them of whether it's working or not, and giving them tons and tons and tons and tons of practice with a whole bunch of cases I've accumulated over teaching the course for so long. It is a very engaging way that they really enjoy. And I get emails from graduates who found a patient who had to be referred, and the physicians are so grateful that it's just really rewarding to hear from them after the fact that what they're doing, it actually was applicable, and they remembered and they applied it and it worked. So again, that engagement factor and that active participation it's worth a lot.
Right. Yeah, and absolutely, to Michelle's point about, right, like, pitch to legislators. Almost every field, almost every faculty member at this institution is in a discipline that is affected in some ways by laws, by regulations, by and whether it's state boards or federal institutions or the NCAA or, you know, some governing body, right? Like, you can pitch to them about how to help, whether it's the industry or the profession, right? And so that's where a little bit of that, it's kind of an applied level of really thinking about the process of what you're doing, not just the skill itself. And that's not to displace the importance of understanding those skills either. So, okay, so I guess this is sort of a kind of add-on here, and this is kind of a little bit of my own sort of backwards design here, is that signature assignments I think could be really valuable, right? But I don't think sometimes it's seen as a point of pressure for departments and faculty so they can satisfy assessment and accreditation. And I don't think there should be that level of friction, but we know that sometimes exists, but it's a way of helping. However, I think the real value of signature assignments is that A, it's an opportunity for active learning environments. And if you do that, especially within a picture, some other thing, is that you're really getting to creative thinking skills, right? Informing, convincing, solving problems. This is all about creative thinking skills. And a lot of times I feel like people around the university are like, oh yeah, we do critical thinking all the time, you know, as we analyze an insect or something. It's like, no, I mean, critical thinking, most academic disciplines actually do way more creative thinking skills than critical thinking skills. And that's okay, that's not even a bad thing. Critical thinking skills are about assessing arguments, looking at the validity of evidence and those sorts of things. But creative thinking skills are how we adapt knowledge to generate ideas, develop plans, and implement proposals. It's not just limited to the fine arts and humanities. It's about originality as well as problem solving, right? And so I kind of think that creative thinking skills are sort of this really valuable thing that often gets overlooked. And part of this is there's this two-step here where you examine something fresh and you create something new. It's a new perspective, a new idea, a new plan. And so I think a lot of us are already doing this, but we don't have a sort of vocabulary with which to implement it. In particular, where we think it's just something they do way over in a class on, on how to write literature or something. But creative thinking skills, I think, are things we already do. And part of creative thinking characteristics that you can assess, it starts off with, what's your problem, right? Tell me your problem, and then I can exercise my creative thinking skills. Recognizing trends, acknowledging contradictions, developing strategies, taking risks, logistical planning, polished execution. So these are, I've included this little bit to try to kind of show you how, again, this process can be, there's an element of scaffolding to it, in that creative thinking is not just like an afterthought. It's actually often integrated in the work that we do, whether that's to improve ourselves as an aspiring therapist, or as a journalist, or as someone who wants to work in a particular profession. And so you start with a problem, and you come up with ways through your knowledge, you apply those. And kind of what I've wanted to do here was show how signature assignments are just not, it's not just this mandate for meeting assessment goals. I think the real kind of action is about how to meet those goals. And I think part of it is active learning environments and creative thinking skills. And this could just be adapted to really any discipline whatsoever. So Jim, earlier you had asked if I could go back to that, one slide with the arrows, and this is it, just like more detailed, in the sense that some of the words have changed. But I just wanted to show you there's basically three things here. Is that there's this sort of research preliminary work where you define the problem, gather information. And again, gathering information, that could be research scholarly research, it can be interviews, it can be, textbook work, it can be group work, but brainstorming ideas, have it developing a sort of working theory. And this stage lends itself very much to group work, but then the application or the instrument, right? The presentation, the paper, the actual field work itself, and then the reflection, self-assessment, peer evaluations. So this may not seem like so radical like the other things I've been, but if this can be adapted to a sort of pitch assignment, right? Then you're creating an active learning environment where creative thinking takes place. Students are able to learn and apply their skills and reflect on that. And that allows us as instructors to assess their comprehension, their skills, and to the extent that they exercise some level of metacognition, right? Like, and so I think there's kind of a way that this sort of all can come together. And so part of what I've tried to do is at least put this together where if you didn't buy the whole thing, is that you would be able to maybe think a little bit differently about creative thinking skills or active learning environments, or how to meet SLOs in just one class, or potentially, and oh yeah, I should bring this up at a department meeting about signature assignments at a department level, a major level, a college level, or even, it would be a long conversation at the institutional level. So all right, so what do we do here today, right? I went over signature assignments, that handy, fancy acronym, ROI, SLO, about how you can maximize meeting your SLOs, including adding creative thinking skills to those SLOs. We talked about the opportunities of active learning environments. The pitch, I think, is a really useful assignment across disciplines in various contexts. And then creative thinking skills. So this is another screenshot from the matrix. This is Morpheus, right? It says, right, a pedagogical world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you. And so really, I think it's up to us about what we would want, but I also think resistance is never futile. And there's a lot that I was trying to go over today with those four things. So I am curious, we have some time to discuss these elements, but also I'm curious if you don't buy it, or to what extent are we limited by the capacity we have personally, or the support we have in our positions to include some of these elements. But okay, so thank you. I think I'll just go back to this thing right now because those were the main things. So questions or thoughts or feedback?
For a non-sci-fi fan, you've got a ton of sci-fi in this thing.
This is true. I don't normally like science fiction or fantasy, but.
So I found this information very helpful. I buy into it, and it helps me connect things that I think will actually be more efficient. And it gives me a terminology to be able to communicate what I'm trying to achieve better, and some really good ideas I can implement to try to build in greater engagement and with longer term outcomes, and making things more applied more frequently in the classroom as they build. And I really like the idea of building that assignment distribute into three parts, where they get feedback along the way as well as points along the way. So it's a It's less procrastination, hopefully greater involvement, and their efforts will be better placed with the feedback after that first initial part when they actually do the assignment, and then adding that reflection to build upon what they've learned. So this has been very helpful for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, in some ways, the real challenge, the real logistical challenge here is, okay, when I have a semester with, where weeks have been lopped off, that's not in a traditional place-based environment, how do I figure out if I am going to add this scaffolding element? I got to create time and space for it, right? And so that may be one reading I have to lop off the schedule. But is that content inviolable to the class, without which the whole thing falls apart, right? And that's why, I mean, there's just this level of, remember that quote I showed about content? And I think it was so valuable because it was like, most faculty think in terms of content, not in terms of outcomes or engagement. And it's like, so, I mean, I struggle with this too. It's like, oh, I want you got to read this stuff, right? And I got to lecture on it. But it's like, man, if I let go a little bit here, I could really facilitate student learning over there.
Well, and I think any time you take the instructor's effort out of it and give students a chance to truly engage, even if a little bit less content is addressed, the content that is addressed will be at a greater depth. When I first graduated as a physical therapist and entered the clinic in Idaho, we had 3 to 6 months to work with someone who'd had a stroke before they went home to a rural setting. And overnight it went down to 2 weeks. That's one of the reasons I ended up back into an academic setting, right? It went down to 2 weeks. But what I discovered is then we suddenly used every single solitary second therapeutically, where before we were wasting a bunch of time. So sometimes these external constraints that cause us to look and make decisions differently produce better outcomes. And anytime I can stop talking and get students engaged and doing the investigation, talking, seeking feedback, et cetera, is actually beneficial, and they may get more out of that than they would have if they read an additional article or chapter or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the constraints of all of this, for instance, in a group class, we try to make sure every student leads at least one group discussion in a particular way with a particular outcome, but it's almost impossible for the instructor to pop in on everyone and grade or evaluate a student. You would only be able to see a couple of minutes of interaction. So again, I think turning more of this over to the students in terms of self-evaluation or group evaluation makes a lot of sense, because that's one of the key constraints, is we don't have time to do the kind of assessment of some of these things and the evaluation of individual students that we might like. So I do agree with that, Nancy.
And when you put them in the role where they're suddenly the one that would be making that decision, they're actually benefiting more than when I'm always playing that role, right? So it's actually, I think, a win-win that may not have happened unless you're pushed by that time constraint.
Yeah, and if they're pushed to make an evaluation, it's the same evaluation, hopefully they'll make on themselves when they're out in the field. And you know, so they've learned to do some of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a little bit different for every discipline. Even within, I mean, you know, Jim and I are in the same department, and what he teaches is like from another planet sometimes. I mean, it's just totally different contexts, and that's okay. I mean, and I think it's about like, what are the contexts within which people interact in your separate fields, right? So again, it could be, as Michelle pointed out, regulatory or political even, right? Like what would be, and Nancy, you brought up this notion of, right, an external constraint, right? So what are the external constraints that are problems to be solved? And what are the external constraints that really frustrate the activity to where you would want to think about maybe lobbying for a change, because that would be important, right? Or the different types of, physical therapy, contexts, right? Whether it's focused on a particular, like sports physical therapy versus dealing with stroke victims or other things. Is there something you want to focus on, right? Like professionally. So yeah.
Zach,
Super.
I wanted to make one quick comment too. Nancy brought this up earlier, but what I really appreciated about your presentation today is I don't do all of these things, but I do some of them. And now I know, how to talk about it and how to talk about it to my students. And, I think about the pitch, and I'm always pitching professional skills to my students. And I'm always trying to connect what we're doing in class to this is going to help you in, when you get out into the field doing whatever it is that you do. And so that's kind of an interesting concept too, is I always think like a coach, is that good coaches tell athletes why they're doing what they're doing in practice. We're running 5-mile repeats today in practice because it's going to really help you when you get to a 10K, and then it makes it a little bit more manageable and they're more motivated to do it. And so I appreciate you giving me that language to pitch professional skills and what we're doing in the class so that my students are excited to learn it because they know it will help them.
But Karen, let's be honest, there are a lot of coaches and perhaps faculty, maybe not at our institution, who say, do this because I said so. That's not the best way to teach or to coach, but right.
Good. Hold on. I've been coaching all wrong all these years.
Right. No, and I think it's also kind of, it's kind of obvious now, right? Like if you, and it comes on both ways, right? Employers have to pitch prospective employees. Employees have to pitch themselves. And sometimes we can be uncomfortable in our own bodies, but if we are pretending to be a sports agent or a consultant to the physical therapy industry, or what have you, it provides a sort of fresh perspective with which to think about the context of our separate fields. And it sort of, I think, again, to go back to this notion of it is a simulation. It isn't just like a crazy computer program where everything is fake. We really create these spaces depending on what we assign and how we choose to invest the space.
So I had never really thought about the space and construct in the classroom, and this change to teaching through Zoom, right, has really impacted physical therapy, because we have a cohort of 24 students in Pocatello taught through distance learning technology with a 24 group in Meridian. So we have faculty over there, we have students over there, and naturally they all get to know each other in their own cohort best while minimally interacting. Our first year students who have just started this semester haven't even met all of their cohorts within their site, and they're getting all sorts of Zoom interactions with people from the other. So it's interesting now because our students are together for 3 years, and they're together as a cohort in each location. From 7:30 a.m. until 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, and studying together on the weekends, right? They're so immersed that this is really changing things up, how the two cohorts are interacting. And I see some real benefits from that mixing naturally, because when you have groups in their third year, they all know what the other person's going to say, pretty much. They already know each other so well that it'll be interesting to watch this group that's beginning through DL exclusively, and not even meeting each other when they're hybrid flex, who's on campus, who isn't, how that changes the dynamics going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great comment. I mean, and I think it shows, and really how I had to, in some ways, change this from when I was supposed to deliver it in April, was just this notion is there's a lot that we're all realizing that we took for granted. And I think that goes for both students as well as faculty alike. And so we're noticing things that maybe we could have noticed, but just sort of didn't recognize because they were just assumed to be normal. And this is not. There's a new normal, but it's an opportunity, I think, for recognizing those elements of interaction and building culture too. Well, anyways, I think we're out of time. Karen, thank you for putting this together. I'm so glad even though this is 6 months after I was initially slated to do this, I'm really happy for the opportunity, and I really appreciate you hosting, and Nancy for you coming, and Jim, thank you for the support as well. And so yeah, the other thing is, I have this for anyone who wants to reach out to me, and I also have kind of tons of different outlines and assessment sheets where I try to create assignments that create these different sort of conditions within the space for these sort of immersive experiences. But thank you, I appreciate it.
Well, Zach, thank you very much. And that was awesome. And this will be posted in soon. Trying to figure out a YouTube channel for Pi. So if you have colleagues who missed it and want to send them to the Pi website, we should get those up soon. So thank you again. It's good to see everybody, and have a great afternoon.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you.